Good evening and welcome to Winchester Cafe Sci. Tonight's speaker is Professor of Nutritional Immunology and Head of the School of Human Development and Health and Faculty of Medicine at the University of Southampton. He has a PhD in Biochemistry from Massey University in New Zealand. He spent 8 years at the University of Oxford, where he began his research on nutrition and immunity and on fatty acids. He was appointed at the University of Southampton in 1995. He is an internationally recognised researcher on nutritional immunology and the metabolism and functionality of fatty acids, with an emphasis on the role of omega-3 fatty acids, which was the subject of his previous talk. He's received many awards and prizes and has held and holds a number of society presidencies and committee chairs. Please welcome Professor Philip Calder.
Yeah, so when I was here, I mean, it doesn't seem so long ago as 2015, but I talked about omega-3s then, and most of our research historically has been around fatty acids, especially omega-3 fatty acids, and over the years, I think that's what our group's research is most recognized as, and some of you may have been here for the omega-3 talk. So I don't consider this a repeat, because the topic is different tonight, because we work on other things as well. So it's really interesting. 3 years ago, most people weren't very interested in immunity, and then something happened, and a lot of people got quite interested, and actually industry were one of the many parts of our ecosystem that got very interested, and companies like food companies I'm talking about, who had never had any interest in immunity before, got in touch with me April, May 2020, saying immunity is our #1 thing now. So a lot of things happened that got a lot of people's attention, but fortunately I think a lot of that is behind us now, although we cannot be too relaxed, if I'm honest with you. So I'm going to talk about whether nutrition is important in supporting the immune system. So, of course, immunity is all about the battle that we have with harmful things in our environment. So we live actually surrounded by harmful microorganisms, bacteria and viruses and so on. And those harmful organisms, of course, can make us sick. That's what coronavirus and COVID-19 have been all about. And we call these harmful microorganisms pathogens. So I think there's a couple of things. One is, first of all, most bacteria and viruses are not harmful to us. Only some of them are harmful. And in fact, some of them are even helpful, and I'll touch on that later on. And the other thing, of course, is this battle between ourselves and microorganisms has always been present and has been one of the things that has driven our evolution, of course. So, of course, you would have learned in the past a lot about the Black Death, for example. People used to think the Black Death was a bacterial disease, but now they know it was actually a viral disease, because I've actually looked in detail at things like church records and village records about how the plague spread through some of the villages, and they explain that as being transmission of viruses. Of course, we've heard a lot about the Spanish flu of just over 100 years ago that was quite devastating right across the globe. So these things have always been with us. I'm not belittling anything that's happened in the last 3 years, because it has been very devastating. But this is part of what has shaped us as we are now in the 21st century. Oh, okay, yeah. Sorry, I've just got to get used to this. Yeah, okay. So our side of this battle is what our immune system is all about. So our immune system is a cell and tissue system that protects us against pathogens, bacteria, viruses, also parasitic worms, fungi, and so on. So we have something to protect us. So how does the immune system work? So here I list 4 key features of the immune system. Firstly, it acts as an exclusion barrier, so it tries to keep out things that don't belong. Secondly, it can recognize and identify things that don't belong. Thirdly, it eliminates, that is, kills things that don't belong. So your immune system kills bacteria, pathogenic bacteria, it kills virally infected cells, and so on. And really importantly, the immune system can remember. It can remember what it's done. So it can remember these encounters. So just a little bit more detail about those 4 functional features. So the exclusion barrier, remember, is to keep things out. So we can imagine things like the skin, the linings of our gut and our lungs. They keep bacteria particularly from getting in. And you know, of course, if you cut your skin, one of the things that can happen is you get a little infection around the cut, right? We've all experienced that, okay? That's why we use Savlon and stuff like that, antiseptic creams, right? So this barrier is really important. We also have an acid stomach. Lots of bacteria don't like acid. So if they get into the stomach, we can kill them. We have proteins in saliva and tears, even antibodies that can mop up bacteria on our surfaces. Okay. But some things can get through. So the immune system can recognize things that don't belong, and it can identify them as harmful or not. Okay, so something may not belong, but could be harmless, in which case there's no point worrying too much about it. Okay. So there are particular, I won't go into this, but there are particular very sophisticated mechanisms by which your immune system can recognize things. Thirdly, as I mentioned, it eliminates things that are harmful. There are different processes for this. One of these is this process called phagocytosis. This is actually where an immune cell actually engulfs, gobbles up, if you like, a whole bacterium and then digests it inside itself. There's direct destruction, so your immune cells can produce chemicals that just bombard bacteria and destroy them. And I mentioned the killing of virally infected cells. And then really importantly, we have this memory component. And what that means is if you've been infected once, your immune system can remember that. So if you get infected by the same organism again, the response is much faster and stronger than it was the first time. So you sort of get a training, if you like. And this memory response is the basis of vaccination. And I'm guessing everyone in the room has had a fair few vaccinations over the last couple of years, right? So what you're doing then is you're actually fooling the immune system to think that you've had a viral infection, in fact. So it makes antibodies, and some of those antibodies remain in your blood for a period of time. But also you produce what are called memory cells. And these are cells that can remember what happened before, and they spring into action if you get, in this case, infected with the virus after you've had vaccination. Okay. So the immune system is very sophisticated. It can recognize, it can eliminate, it can remember. And this sophistication comes about because there are many, many different types of immune cells. Okay, the detail of this doesn't matter too much, but many of you will have had blood tests where you might have had your white blood cells counted. You people had that maybe, white cell count. So that's count, white cells are the immune cells in your bloodstream. Okay, they're not just in the bloodstream, they're elsewhere as well. And there are many different types. So we have cells called neutrophils, we have cells called monocytes, we have cells called lymphocytes, and so on. So there's all these different divisions, if you like, okay, a bit like being in the military or something like that, or different instruments in an orchestra, if you like, and they each have their own role, okay? And they're, generally speaking, they're divided into innate immunity and acquired immunity. And innate immunity is something you have all the time. That includes the barrier functions. It includes some cells, like natural killer cells. They kill virally infected cells. And these phagocytic cells. These are the cells that engulf bacteria and destroy them. So Innate immunity is there all the time. It's not trained in the way that acquired immunity is trained. Acquired immunity is just what the name says. You have to acquire it. And you acquire it by being exposed to organisms. Acquired immunity involves T lymphocytes or T cells and B lymphocytes or B cells. Okay? There are lots of different subtypes. The detail doesn't matter. They just have different roles, just like the different instruments in an orchestra. Okay? T lymphocytes are the cells that make antibodies. Okay? Now there's a link between innate immunity and acquired immunity, and that link is this process here. So when phagocytes engulf a bacterium and digest it, inside them, okay, they take components of the digested bacteria, and those components actually move onto the outside surface of the phagocytic cell, okay? And then those bits of bacteria on the surface of your phagocytes are actually seen by T lymphocytes. And it turns out those T lymphocytes have been pre-programmed to recognize those bits of bacteria. And those bits of bacteria or viruses are called antigens. So you would have heard again in the last few years about antigens against coronavirus or spike protein and stuff like that, okay? So what this means is bits of bacteria or viruses that come from this process of engulfing trigger acquired immune response. So you've now acquired a response, and this acquired immune response is really powerful. There are lots of different types of T cells that do all sorts of things, but the T cells also instruct the B cells to make antibodies. Okay? So this is pretty sophisticated stuff. So the detail of this also doesn't matter. It's just to show you that all these different cells work together to give you a good immune response. So here we have a virally infected cell. That's actually recognized by some types of immune cells, including these natural killer cells. They set out just to destroy the cell, giving the virus nowhere to live. There's also, this is a phagocyte that can actually take up viral particles and digest viruses. Then the antigens from the viruses appear on the surface, other cells become activated, and in the end, all of this causes B cells to make antibodies. And it's the role of antibodies to neutralize viruses or bacteria. So I'm simply showing that all these cells are working together. Again, like all the instruments in an orchestra are working together to make nice music, right? In this case, it's a good immune response. Of course, if you're deficient in any one of those immune cells, which some people are, you will have a weakened immune response. I mentioned already white blood cell count, which some of you agreed you had had at some stage. So you've got immune cells circulating in your bloodstream, but actually most of them are hidden away in discrete places in your body. Only about 2% of your immune cells are in the bloodstream at any one time. They're actually moving in and out of the bloodstream. So for example, they will go to the skin and sort of say, you know, is there anything going on here that I should be concerned about? Oh no, okay, I'll go back and I'll look somewhere else. So they're moving around in your bloodstream and also in lymph, looking for pathogens, and they come together in different places around the body, and that's where the cells actually communicate with one another. So you can imagine all this stuff here would be pretty difficult to do in the bloodstream, because these cells are moving around at whatever the speed of the bloodstream is, whatever, 90 miles an hour, I can't remember now. So it's going to be a little bit hard for them to interact with one another. So they save their interactions for when they come together in discrete organs within the body. Now, first of all immune cells are made in bone marrow, okay? And most of them actually come out of bone marrow already mature, ready to go, okay? T lymphocytes are different. They come out of bone marrow and they go to the thymus. That's a little organ that sits just above the heart, and they mature in the thymus, okay? This is really important because as we age, our thymus becomes smaller and smaller, okay? And actually, it starts to shrink in early adulthood. And that means we have less capacity to produce new T lymphocytes as we age. I'll come back to that shortly. So the sites of immune cell production, or the site is the bone marrow, and the sites of maturation are the bone marrow and the thymus. Okay? When the cells are moving all around the body, all over the show, but they come together to interact with one another in places like lymph nodes. Okay, again, you'll probably be familiar with lymph nodes. And that's where these cells, they move in there, and that's where all those communications that I showed you on the previous slide happen. That can also happen in the spleen, and it can also happen in other places. For example, these are little, they're like lymph nodes, but they're along the gut wall. Okay, I'll come back to that later on. I don't run out of time. So, just to step back again, we have the barrier to keep harmful things out, but we have the cellular components of innate and acquired immunity to deal with those things if they get through, okay? And that's the identification, the elimination, and the memory. So, a well-functioning immune system is key to giving people good defense against pathogenic organisms, okay? And one of the things of great concern, of course, over the last few years was people who are immunosuppressed or immunocompromised in some way, because if you have a weaker immune system, you're less able to defend yourself. So you're more able to get infected in the first place, more likely to get infected in the first place, and you're more likely for that infection to be more severe. It's not the only explanation for why one person might have more severe infectious disease than another, but it's one of the explanations, and it's more important in some people than others. Anyway, having a strong immune system is good. So weak immunity gives us poor defense against harmful organisms, gives us infection. And people have been aware of this for decades now, particularly with research in less developed countries where there's high exposure to pathogenic organisms. And for example, people either with diseases that weaken the immune system or with malnutrition, which weakens the immune system, are at much greater risk of infection if there are pathogens around. Of course, if there are no pathogens, it doesn't really matter. So that's why, for example, when you have famine, where you have people in a refugee camp, one of the big issues is infectious disease. So you might hear of cholera outbreaks, for example, typhoid outbreaks, things like that. Okay. So people have been quite interested in what are the things that actually influence the immune system. So if we took blood from everyone in the room here and we measured in our laboratory, and I've got 3 people from our group sitting at the back there. So if they got to work in the lab and measured some immune markers in your blood, the results they would get would be highly variable across the room. In other words, you wouldn't all be the same, okay? Just like you're not all the same in lots of other things. How fast you can run, how quickly you can do the crossword, all those things, okay? So there's differences in your immune performance as well, okay? Why is that? So some of that is genetics. So your immune system is set up genetically different from one another. Of course, infection history, vaccination. Some illnesses impact the immune response, some medications, cigarette smoking, alcohol consumption, they also can weaken the immune system a bit. But stress, psychological stress, physical stress, sleep deprivation, all those things weaken the immune system. Being obese weakens the immune system, being frail weakens the immune system. Both of those things are at least partly related to nutrition, of course. But there are some things that help the immune system, strengthen it if you like. So being physically fit. So all other things being equal, a physically fit person will also have a more fit immune system. Our diet is important. I'm going to say something about that. And our gut microbiota is important. I'm going to say something about that. Stage of the life course is important. What do I mean by that? I mean the change over life from when we're born to older age. That's also important. I think I've got a slide on that. So lifestyle factors that are important. Weakening immunity, stress, sleep deprivation, smoking, excess alcohol, obesity, and poor diet. Supporting immunity, being physically fit, having a good diet, and having a healthy weight. Of course, those 3 things may be related to one another. So this is just a schematic about immune system across the life course. So I've called the 2 ends of the life course period of immune vulnerability. So if we start on the left, We're born with an immature immune system, just like we're born with an immature visual system, an immature cognitive system, an immature musculoskeletal system. Of course, those things develop at different rates. So the visual system develops more quickly than some of the others. So in other words, the baby can see much earlier than it can walk, which is fortunate, I guess. You're born with a weak immune system, and your immune system has to be educated over the first few years of life. Again, if we took blood from a baby and looked at the immune cell types, they're quite different from if you look at adults. They change actually over the first year or two of life. Immune cells don't work very well in babies. Of course, the baby has to receive through breast milk what we call passive immunity, so antibodies from the mother, for example. There are actually also immune cells in breast milk and lots of other immune factors. So there's this maturing of the immune system early in life. And of course, you all, if you've had children or grandchildren, you'll know, of course, that kids are at much greater risk, little kids are at much greater risk of infections when they encounter pathogens. So once they go to daycare, of course, you have this never-ending battle with respiratory illness, diarrheal illness, what have you, as they get exposed to all these new organisms that they didn't have before. But, you know, by the time they're whatever, depends when they start nursery, of course, but certainly by the time they're going to primary school, you're not really so worried about those things anymore. They can cope with all of that. So even if they get the exposure, their immune system has been educated so that it can cope. We know also that some older people show immune decline, just as older people may show musculoskeletal decline, cognitive decline, whatsoever. They also can show immune decline, and this is called immunosenescence. So the immune system going to sleep, if you like. And immunosenescence is quite a big area of research. So what's different about the immune systems in older people compared to younger adults, and does it matter? So one of the things that was already known is that in general, vaccines don't work so well in older people compared to younger adults. It's not that they don't work, they just don't work as well. This is true of the seasonal influenza vaccine. It's true of the COVID-19 vaccines, which is one reason, of course, why older people were higher in the queue, always get vaccinations, and maybe needed more than younger people. So these are data from coronavirus pandemic. This is mortality in 4 different countries. South Korea is blue, Spain is yellow, China is purple, and Italy is green. And this is mortality rate by age. And all this is doing is telling you what you already know, because you lived through it. Okay, one of the first things that doctors noticed was there seemed to be more older people dying than younger people. And actually younger people, even if they were infected, didn't seem to be badly infected. And interestingly, despite what I just said about lack of immune maturation in really young people, for reasons that are still not fully understood, they weren't so badly affected by coronavirus infection. But all this shows is wherever you look is this pattern of higher mortality with increasing age. And one of the reasons for this, I think, is immunosenescence, this age-related immune decline. So one of the things that happens as we age is our bone marrow doesn't put out as many new immune cells. And remember, that's where all of your immune cells come from. So your bone marrow sort of just slows down. It's like a factory, and the factory slows down as you age. I already mentioned this thymic shrinkage. It's called involution. That actually starts to happen when we're about 30 to 40. So you get reduced output of new T cells from the thymus. These are T cells that haven't seen action yet, okay? New conscripts, if you like. Okay? So the thymus isn't so good at producing these new conscripts as you age. What that means is older people have fewer T lymphocytes in the blood. T cells are really important. There's also a change in balances of different types of immune cells in the blood of older people. And because they've got fewer of these new naive T cells, it means they can't respond so well to new antigens. They can respond quite well to things I've already seen before because they have memory cells still. There are other changes, and in general, immune cells just don't work so well in older people, okay? That means you get less antibody production, etc. That means older people have weaker vaccination responses, increased infection risk, and poorer wound healing. And I think you'll probably all be familiar with those things, either through your own experience or what's been happening around us for a long time now. Okay, so I think this is repeating some of that. More infections, more illness, more hospitalizations, more antibiotic use. Older people are the biggest users of antibiotics of any age group, contributing to antibiotic resistance. Poorer vaccination responses. That was well known from seasonal flu vaccines for decades now. More deaths from infection, as we've seen. So that's the immune system. So let me come on to nutrition now. This is part 2, if you like. A lot of people struggle with why nutrition could be important to the immune system. I don't know why they struggle, because nutrition is important to every system in the body, right? Cognitive system, cardiovascular system, metabolic system, you've got to have the right nutrition for the body to work properly. So the immune system needs a lot of energy. So if you think about antibodies are proteins that have to be produced from amino acids. So B lymphocytes are like antibody producing factories, right? If you're producing something in a factory, you need energy to drive the production line. So that's just one example. The immune system needs its energy sources, and all of the energy sources your body needs come from what you eat, right? You can't make energy yourself, you use stuff you eat, right? Building blocks, I just mentioned, you've got to make antibodies, all sorts of other proteins. You get massive changes in protein synthesis when you're infected. Lots of the metabolic regulation of the immune response is actually carried out by some vitamins and minerals. So zinc, vitamin A, vitamin D are really important for controlling how immune cells are working. There are actually some chemicals involved in this battle with microorganisms that are produced from nutrients. So a good example is this substance, nitric oxide, which can kill bacteria. That's made directly from the amino acid arginine. There are some nutrients that seem to have rather special roles in combating infection. Vitamin D is one, zinc is another. As part of, so if you think about this battle between your immune system and microorganisms, one of the things the immune system is doing is trying to make the environment hostile to the invader. That's actually one reason why you get fever. You try to make the body too hot for the bacteria to survive. So you try to create a hostile environment. So you create inflammatory stress and oxidative stress because bacteria and viruses don't like that. But your own cells don't like that either. So you've got to be protected from yourself, okay? And that's where antioxidant vitamins like C and E, sulfur amino acid cysteine, lots of minerals, some things you get from plants seem to have this sort of activity. That's pretty important. And then I'm going to say something, if I don't run out of time, about gut microbiota. And of course, your diet, except for antibiotics, your diet is the biggest contributor to shaping your gut microbiota. So these are nutrients that are important to support the immune system. Every one of these has decades of research of different types. Okay, so we don't need to go into detail. It's just a listing. Soluble vitamins all have a role, especially vitamin A. And in fact, for many years, people called vitamin A the anti-infective vitamin because it's so important in the immune system. And if you go to some developed countries, they still refer to vitamin A as the anti-infective vitamin. Okay? A and D particularly, water-soluble vitamins, the B vitamins, vitamin C, lots of minerals are really, really important to support the immune system. Many amino acids, not just essential amino acids, but some others, and essential fatty acids are really important. So there's a whole raft of these things that are important. So what that means is if you have micronutrient deficiencies, so if you're deficient in a vitamin that's important to the immune system, your immune system is going to be weakened. If you're deficient in a mineral that's important to the immune system, your immune system is going to be weakened. So, for example, people who are zinc deficient have weaker immune systems. This is very well described in developed countries. People who are iron deficient, people who are copper deficient, people who are vitamin A deficient, all have weakened immune systems. But more generally, malnutrition itself weakens the immune system. So not getting enough protein, not getting enough energy, not getting enough essential nutrients. This has been very clearly demonstrated decades ago in less developed countries, particularly for infants and children, but it's also clear mainly from studying hospitalized older people that occurs in older people, and also in some other population groups. People with anorexia, for example, people with chronic alcoholism, for example, all have some forms of malnutrition that weaken their immune system. Now, I mentioned in passing this process of inflammation, and inflammation seems to be something that people think we should be scared of, right? And that's because people like me go around telling everyone that inflammation is harmful, and we have ways of controlling inflammation, which we actually do. But inflammation is part of the way you defend yourself. So what happens is, if you get infected, for example, part of the innate immune system is inflammation. And inflammation is one of the ways to make the environment hostile to invaders. Okay? Actually, fever is part of the inflammatory response. What should happen is when it's done its job, it should turn itself off. We call that resolution. And you should return to normal. Okay? If that doesn't happen, that's bad news. So you get tissue injury and pathology. So an example here might be rheumatoid arthritis, for example, which is an inflammatory disease that's treated with anti-inflammatory medication. So in somebody with rheumatoid arthritis, they have unresolved inflammation that's damaging to joints particularly, and you try to control that with pharmaceuticals. But unresolved inflammation is not good. It turns out that human aging is associated with increased blood levels of inflammatory markers. So again, some of you might have heard of C-reactive protein. That's like the key biomarker of the inflammatory response. If you look in the blood of older people, CRP, C-reactive protein, is higher than it is in younger adults. It's not as high as it is in someone with an inflammatory disease. So in other words, someone with arthritis has higher levels of CRP than an age-matched person without arthritis, if that makes sense to you. Okay? And again, this increase in inflammation with aging has been given a name. It's called inflammaging. Okay. So it's a good name. So having a weak immune system makes you at risk of infections, but having an elevated inflammation, and having a weak immune system makes you at risk of infection. And of course, that's very dangerous in the short term if you get infected, right? As you all know from what's happened in the last few years. Inflammaging is also considered to be or believed to be deleterious, elevated inflammation with aging, over the long term. So this is a slow process. And it turns out that cardiovascular disease involves some inflammation. Metabolic disease involves some inflammation. So this is sort of, in cardiovascular disease, this is inflammation of the blood vessel walls, for example. In metabolic disease, inflammation of fat tissue, inflammation of the pancreas, inflammation of the liver, cognitive decline, inflammation in the central nervous system. Inflammation actually also drives changes in body composition. So it actually causes slow loss of muscle. Interestingly, although inflammation is part of the immune system, this inflammation also drives a weakened immune system itself. And then some cancers require an inflammatory environment. So we can explain things that happen with aging, at least partly through this ramped up inflammation. So it turns out there are lots of nutrients that are also important in controlling inflammation. And some of these appeared on the previous list of supporting the immune response. The vitamins A, D, and E, vitamin C, zinc, copper, and selenium, omega-3 fatty acids that I talked about last time. And people think some of these compounds that give plants, fruits and vegetables and what have you color are also important. So again, just to remind you, what we're really talking about here is a barrier, keep things out, and then this powerful mechanism for dealing with things if they get through. Barriers include the skin, talked about that. If you cut yourself, you get infection. The respiratory tract, genitourinary tract, but also the gastrointestinal tract, okay? And it turns out the gastrointestinal tract is full of bacteria, particularly the large intestine, or the colon, as it's called, okay? Chock full of bacteria, also viruses, fungi, and so on. Most of these are harmless, okay? And in fact, people believe many of them are really important to health. But there's this whole science about gut microbiota or gut microbiome, some of you might have heard of. It's all about the relationship between the bacteria that live in your gut and your state of health, okay? It seems to be important as far as immunity and inflammation is concerned. So this is a picture of, this is what we call the gut lumen. This is actually the interior of the gut. This is where all of these bacteria are living. It's also where the remainder of food you've eaten, so you've digested it, usually in the small intestine, you've absorbed what the body can absorb, and what's left goes to the large intestine, and of course that's what comes out in feces in the end. But in between, the gut bacteria have been feasting on the remains of your meal, okay? And it turns out that people who eat different, have different dietary patterns, so that's the composition of your whole diet across a day, a week, a month, have different types of gut bacteria. So again, if we sampled everyone in this room, you would have quite different bacteria, partly determined by your diet. Okay. You are separated from these gazillions of organisms by a single cell layer. So your gut is only one cell thick, okay? These cells are called gut epithelial cells. Obviously you need these are called tight junctions because they stop all the stuff from your colon actually getting into your body, right? If you get a breakdown in gut barrier, which actually can happen in malnutrition, stuff can leak from the gut lumen into the body. That's called leaky gut. Some of you might have heard of that. Okay. Now, I mentioned before that only 2% of your immune cells are in the bloodstream at any one time. I mentioned thymus, I mentioned lymph nodes, I mentioned spleen, and in passing I mentioned the gut wall. And it turns out about 70% of your immune cells are associated with the gut wall at any one time. So that's an enormous complement of immunity in the gut wall. The reasons for that are obvious. If you've got gazillions of organisms in your gut, you've got to make some decisions about whether they're harmful or harmless, and you've got to deal with the harmful ones, okay? So you have this massive complement of immune cells actually embedded in the gut wall. In fact, it turns out they go in and out of the gut wall and they go to other places, including the lungs, by the way. So actually they're organized into different structures and they interact with one another. And there are mechanisms which actually are not very well understood, by which they sample the contents of the gut lumen. There's even a belief that these cells actually reach out between the epithelial cells and actually physically sample what's out there, okay? So they're sampling what's out here and they're coming together and doing all the things I mentioned before, communicating with one another, and they're saying, are these bacteria harmful or harmless, right? If they're harmless, they don't do anything. If they're harmful, they can mount an active immune response, which is targeted back out here, but also systemically. So the details don't really matter, but it turns out that there's a pretty strong suggestion that gut microbiota is an important determinant of immunity and inflammation. So one reason why you all have different immune markers in your blood is because you have different gut microbiota. There's one way to think about it. So we've got a gut microbiota immune system interaction. We've got a gut microbiota inflammation interaction. Inflammation is actually part of the immune system, but also the host is trying to control the bugs, and the bugs are trying to control the host. So this is a true symbiotic relationship between the microorganisms in your gut and your immune system. Now, I mentioned in aging, we have immunosenescence, a decline in the immune system. We have inflammation, this ramping up of the inflammatory response. And it turns out also that as people age, their gut microbiota changes. And that could be many things. It could be dietary change, it could be illness, it could be medications, it's all sorts of things. But people wonder whether these three things are related to one another. So as your gut microbiota changes, you drive a change in the immune system. Of course, as your immune system changes, you drive a change in the gut microbiota. So I mentioned before, you can support the immune system through nutritional strategies. You can help control inflammation through nutritional strategies, but actually you can also influence your gut microbiota. So people who eat more fiber have a different gut microbiota than people who eat less fiber, for example. There are also sugars called prebiotics. These are different from your sugar that you put in your tea or whatever. These are actually sugars that you can't digest yourself, but which bacteria can digest because they have a different metabolism. Some of these prebiotic sugars also seem to foster healthy bacteria. And then, of course, you're probably familiar with probiotics. These are live bacteria. You might be familiar with them in yogurts and things like that, but all fermented foods contain live bacteria. Okay, anything that's been fermented, unless it's then been pasteurized, but if it's been fermented, it will contain live bacteria. Okay? And many cultures where food is less processed consume either on purpose or by accident fermented foods a lot. But I think probably until relatively recently, even in this country, people were consuming much more fermented food than they do now. Going off on a tangent there. Right, so I'm coming on to the last bit now. So just going back to your kind introduction, we conduct research at this interface that I've just drawn out for you, at the interface of nutrition, immunity, inflammation, and gut microbiota. And we're a little bit unique in that regard in Southampton. Of course, one of the things I've been really interested in, as I mentioned at the start, is omega-3 fatty acids and how that comes in here, but also we're interested in other things. So I just want to finish up by telling you about a bit of research that we're doing. So we were very fortunate a little bit before COVID to get a grant from the Medical Research Council, which is one of the government bodies for giving grants for people to conduct high quality research. So I got a grant to lead a consortium of ourselves and 3 other universities and a research institute, which is in Norwich, to try to link up the UK expertise in nutrition, immunity, and microbiota. So the Quadram Institute is in Norwich. They're one of probably the UK's biggest expert group in gut microbiota. We're expert in nutrition and nutritional immunology. This group in Birmingham who are expert in age-related changes in the immune and inflammatory system. And then Newcastle University also have some diet strengths in understanding people's diets. And people in Nottingham, actually some mathematicians, want to model sort of relationship that I drew up as just 3 simple things: microbiota, immunity, inflammation. Of course, to the mathematician, that's way too simplistic. We've got to have a mathematical model to try to explain that. Okay. So anyway, we're very lucky to have this grant. We're very unlucky that we got it just before COVID came along, because that messed everything up well and truly. So we're actually doing a study to try to bring our consortium together, focus on things that I've told you about. So we're doing a trial looking at the effect of vitamin D, looking at the effect of this probiotic organism, and we're looking at these two things separately from one another, but also together with one another. And there's also a placebo, and we're doing this in people aged over 60, so it's a trial, and we're looking at all the things I've told you about. The gut microbiota, measurements of immunity and inflammation in the blood, and lots of other things, blood, lipids, body composition, muscle strength, and so on. So this is a little bit about our study. 104 people, it's got a particular design. This is what I mentioned, placebo, vitamin D, this is micrograms, by the way. This probiotic, or both of them together, 12 weeks, funded by the MRC, and of course we're currently doing this. So I don't know, there might be people here a bit interested in this, I don't know. Just to tell you a little bit, I mean, doing trials in people is quite complicated. We've done a lot of trials, especially of omega-3s and other things. We've done some probiotic and prebiotic trials before. These trials are really complicated. So we have to make some judgments about people we want to study, partly because some characteristics can interfere with things that we're looking at. So we're really looking for all, people aged 60 plus, relatively healthy BMI, obviously want to do the study, give consent. And there are some things that we exclude, things around having some active diseases, having some medicines, and some other things. So the way our study works is, you can't read this, nor can I, no one can, is we've got a clinical research facility in Southampton, so people come in, they give consent, we measure things like their body composition, their grip strength, we take some blood, some urine, they will provide a fecal sample and answer some questionnaires, then they get one of the treatments, and then 12 weeks later they come back and all of that is repeated. And these are the things we're measuring, and lots of these things I've measured in passing. You know, white blood cell count, different types of immune cells in blood, markers of inflammation and immunity, things to do with the fecal microbiota, quality of life, dietary intake, lots of metabolic markers and what have you. So just to finish up, this is the key message really, things that everyone can do throughout adulthood support their immune system. And this is just the same as supporting the cognitive system, the cardiovascular system, the musculoskeletal system. It's no different from those messages. Achieve and maintain a healthy weight, keep physically fit, reduce stress and sleep well. You know, those are not easy things, but you know, that's like the wish list. Ensure an adequate intake of all essential nutrients and adopt a diet that promotes a healthy, diverse gut microbiota. So that's it. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Philip. That's fascinating coverage of very interesting subject. You should realise now that nobody gets to leave until they've been screened for this next study intake.
Well, if anyone is interested in our study, we're very happy to talk to you, for sure. That's not the reason for being here. That was a coincidence, but for me, a happy coincidence. But, yeah.
Well, indeed. And yeah. The students at the back with clipboards.
Yeah.
We're going to take a short break for people to refresh their glasses and come back as reasonably soon as you can. That would be great. Our next talk is on Monday, the 3rd of April, and it's Professor Robert Marsh from the Oceanography Institute on the many ways that ocean currents shape the natural world, affect people around the world, and understand climate change. So we will resume shortly. Thank you.